Welcome in to the 411 on Wrestling Podcast. I am your host, Blake Lovell, and flying solo for this episode of the podcast and going to run through some quick news and notes in what has been a pretty eventful week thus far in the world of professional wrestling. Let's start with WWE, which has gotten the most attention this week, and that is because of lots of changes to Monday Night Raw after it was announced that Drew McIntyre had tested positive for COVID-19. McIntyre wound up speaking on Raw and kind of talking about the situation. And of course, in terms of the actual show itself, that led to Triple H being inserted as he kicked off the show and then was in the main event against Randy Orton. But most of the talk coming out of the main event was not Triple H versus Randy Orton and what was a very short interaction between those two. It was indeed Alexa Bliss using the fireball to pretty much ignite Randy Orton's eyes. And fire has seemingly been a main theme on WWE television here as of late. We remember back to Randy Orton setting Bray Wyatt on fire, and then you had Alexa basically begging Randy to set her on fire, and now you have Alexa using the fire against Randy. So that has been a significant development, and really, when you think back to the rumors that we discussed about USA Network wanting more adult content, that was the report that was out there several weeks ago, and wanting maybe WWE to embrace more of that adult, dark type of content. Well, since then, we've seen a lot of fire, so that's something that has undoubtedly been a change in terms of some of the things that maybe you expected them to do after they had that record low rating several weeks ago. It also brought about doing the Legends Night, and really, with the success of Legends Night, I think that's why we saw Triple H inserted and them hyping it up several hours before the show about how he was going to kick off the show. I mentioned on Twitter, I think you could pretty much tell at that point by inserting Triple H, and the way they worded it was about, what Orton had did on Legends Night and sort of disrespecting the Legends. And so that the wording made it sound like Triple H was going to wrestle and more than likely was going to be inserted against Randy Orton in the main event. It wasn't your usual main event match. This wasn't a callback to, their WrestleMania matches of years ago and all the different matches they've had over the years. But I think you see, when they had the success ratings-wise that they did with Legends Night, they got that ratings bump they were looking for, and knowing that you were going up against the college football national championship game between Alabama and Ohio State on Monday night, you knew the ratings were going to be down anyways. So you try to do what you can, and what better way than to bring back a legend in Triple H, knowing that the week before you had just gotten a big boost in terms of the ratings, bringing back Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan and all these other guys. So I can't say it's a surprise the way they went about it. I know that really the closing angle is everything that people are focused on, and the ratings for this week were not, they weren't where they were on Legends Night, and we knew that. They were down to, I think it's around 1.8 million viewers, somewhere in there. So I don't know that you read a whole lot into that. I think you really start to read into the ratings if you want to pay attention to those, which, that's WWE's thing. I think outside of WWE, do they mean a whole lot for the average fan? Maybe not. But if you're WWE, I think you start to look at the ratings now. Once you've gotten past doing the Legends Night, which they've done before, and now knowing that, you went up against the college football national championship game, you had a drop. So what's next? And I think that's the biggest thing at this point is, what is next for them? How do they build these long-term stars to where they're not having to pull out the stunts of going to Legends Night, to doing some of this other stuff? When can they build a brand on Raw to the point to where you don't have to go to your bag of tricks to bring the ratings back up? They just naturally start to go back up because you're building stars that are just progressively getting over and over even more. And I think that's just the one thing that we've seen with WWE. Outside of a few obvious examples, what Roman Reigns is doing, we've talked about it before on the podcast. I think he's one of the best in the game right now in terms of what he's doing, but they just have not been able to, build these sustainable stars to this point because there is still a lot of the 50-50 back and forth type stuff to where, no one's getting over, and you're having everyone beat everyone, and that just, leads to not everyone being able to get over. So I think that's the big thing for the ratings at this point is how do you build those stars? If you care about ratings, which again, if you're outside of WWE, they don't really affect the casual fan. It's, for WWE, they're trying to keep these ratings up for advertisers, for USA Network. They want to keep them happy. If you're WWE and you're trying to keep these ratings going in the right direction, you've got to build more stars. You've got to build more consistency, coherent storytelling. I think that's the biggest thing, because right now, in terms of Raw, which, SmackDown's a little bit different, but in terms of Raw, Raw just feels like a show week to week that does not follow any sort of set guideline from the week before. It just seems like that everything is thrown together, and we always read the reports and rumors about, the script being torn up in the afternoon and being put together on the fly and the show not being done before it even starts. These are things that are holding Raw back right now. So if you're a fan of Raw, if you're a fan of WWE, the best thing WWE can do is just be more consistent and be able to build better stars. And the only way to do that is to do a little bit better in terms of their long-term planning, because right now that has been an issue. And I think for the ratings-wise, that is certainly something that a lot of people have discussed. And we'll see if they can get things back on track. And the bigger story right now is, with the whole Drew McIntyre thing in terms of him testing positive. And, it's a matter of who else, could be in that mix in terms of who was around him. When did they find out? There's lots of things that you probably really won't know about the situation. I know people have pointed out some of the people who were not on television on Raw on Monday night, and maybe, you can play the guessing game all you want, but I think without actually knowing the details, it's hard to do that. But we'll see. I mean, as of right now, looking ahead to the Royal Rumble, we're still going to get Drew McIntyre versus Goldberg. That is another subject in and of itself about whether people are excited to see a Goldberg title shot here in this spot. I know some people are worried that Goldberg could actually win this thing. I don't know. I think you never put anything past WWE in these scenarios when it comes to the legends and Goldberg. We've seen him in these spots before. I mean, really just think back a year ago. We were talking about this with, him being in the spot and going into, WrestleMania where he was. So I can't say that it's ever out of the question when it comes to these things, but you would expect for Drew McIntyre to win and maybe just sort of, get that rub from a legend like Goldberg after the match. But I think you never say never. That seems to be the common phrase and theme that's used with WWE. But you would think that Drew McIntyre wins this match, goes on to WrestleMania to face someone. And speaking of the Royal Rumble, the betting odds right now, we have fun looking at the betting odds, although ultimately, do they mean a whole lot? Not really. But as of right now, it seems like the favorites on the men's side continue to be Daniel Bryan as the betting favorite at this point to win, which, in that scenario, you would expect him to go on and challenge Roman Reigns unless Reigns loses to Adam Pearce, which that I think we can say never. I don't think Adam Pearce is going to beat Roman Reigns, so I think we may be able to use that in that scenario. But Daniel Bryan, the top favorite at least right now, that would seemingly be the person to win the Royal Rumble, go on to face Reigns. Big E is also in that discussion. I think Keith Lee actually has pretty good odds as well. So those are the top three seemingly. I think Edge maybe in the top five. I don't know injury-wise, where Edge is. Could he come back and get there? I'm sure it's possible. It seemed like that could have been the direction at one point where all the rumors were that we were going to get Edge and Orton again, or, potentially at WrestleMania, or having him challenge for a shot at the title. I don't know that necessarily that's the case now. But Big E, Daniel Bryan, I think you would probably put those in the top two in terms of the guys who should win the Rumble on the men's side. On the women's side, Bianca Belair is still the favorite, and really we've added these betting odds on 411 over the past several months. It seems like Bianca Belair has really been at the top the entire way outside of Rhea Ripley, who is probably at this point the second favorite because, the rumors about her being called up and all that. So that, offers some intrigue in and of itself. I think on the women's side, there are probably more unknowns, but at least you feel like on the men's side, you've got to think that it's Daniel Bryan, Big E, maybe Keith Lee. I don't know. I mean, I think given what they've done with Keith Lee, that's another discussion you could probably have for a longer amount of time. But there's lots of possibilities, so it's going to be interesting to see, and we'll have full thoughts on the Royal Rumble heading into the show on January 31st. As for Impact Wrestling and AEW, we can probably throw those two into the same discussion because Impact does have Hard to Kill coming up on Saturday, as it will be on pay-per-view. And it is headlined by the big six-man tag team match with Kenny Omega and the Good Brothers teaming up against Rich Swann and the Motor City Machine Guns. I think the build to this has been pretty good in terms of hyping this up. I think, after the initial crossover you had, a lot of people were wondering, is this going to be sort of an invasion-style scenario where, you have lots of different people all of a sudden just go back and forth? I think they've done it the right way in that if you do that right off the bat, or if that's part of the plan, it takes away some of that suspense. And I think by just having a few guys here and there. We've seen the Good Brothers now appear on Dynamite, but having Omega go over and put in the spot to build to this big match, I think they've done it actually in a pretty effective manner because you haven't just sort of thrown everything at the wall right away. There's still lots of different options they can run with here. So there's plenty of intrigue, suspense with this match just because you don't really know how it's going to play out. Does Kenny Omega wind up pinning the Impact champion? Does Rich Swann, does he wind up pinning Kenny Omega to lead to a potential match between those two down the line? Who knows? But I think there's lots of different ways they could go with this. I think just on the surface, you would think that Omega and the Good Brothers are getting the win here because of kind of where they are. They've had the reunion, the Bullet Club reunion on AEW with the Bucks, all this other stuff. But I think it's at least a match that a lot of people are going to probably tune in to see because it is different, and it's just different in this era of wrestling. We're not used to seeing this, and I think that's why there was so much excitement whenever you had this right off the bat and had the whole Don Callis thing and everything sort of come together the way it did after Omega won the title from Jon Moxley. So plenty of excitement heading into this. And in terms of the rest of the card, you've got Eddie Edwards versus Sami Callihan in the Barbed Wire Massacre. Given the history between those two, that should certainly be one that will probably be a noteworthy development in terms of their feud between those. You've got a three-way match for the X Division Championship. Chris Bay taking on Manik and Rohit Raju in there. Deonna Purrazzo is going to defend the Knockouts Championship against Taya Valkyrie. The Knockouts Tag Team titles on the line. Kiera Hogan, Tasha Steelz taking on Havoc and Navaya there for the inaugural Knockouts Tag titles. Eric Young going to team with Diener and Joe Doring to take on Rhino, Tommy Dreamer, and Cousin Jake in an old school rules match. Ethan Page and the Karate Man are going to square off. This should certainly be quite an interesting situation there. I don't know, do you call it a match? I don't know, but it's. I think Impact uses the word bizarre to hype this, and that sounds about right to me in terms of what this could be. But I think because Ethan Page is involved, and really not knowing his future as well, I think there's lots of ways they could go with this. And they just added Tenille Dashwood and Caleb are going to take on Rosemary and Crazy Steve. So that's the lineup as of right now here as we're recording this. And it's also worth noting on Hard to Kill, there's going to be a new announce team involved as Josh Matthews and Madison Rain, no longer the commentators for Impact, as they announced on Wednesday that it was going to be Matt Stryker and D'Lo Brown are the new announce team for Impact Wrestling. Josh Matthews being promoted, signing a new multi-year deal, but being promoted to a senior producer role with Impact, so he's going to be doing more behind-the-scenes stuff. So that's sort of a fresh restart, I think, there for them in terms of their commentary. That gives people, a little more incentive. It almost feels like a new sort of era in terms of this for Impact, not only doing the crossover with AEW, but also a new announce team. So that's another significant thing heading into Saturday's show. In terms of AEW, I'm recording this on Wednesday afternoon, which means that the action for New Year's Smash Night 2 has not yet taken place, but is headlined by Darby Allin defending the TNT title against Brian Cage and some other matches on that show. There should be a lot of fun as well for that. But I think the most intriguing part for wrestling fans now is in terms of where things go from here with this AEW and Impact partnership. What's next? I have to believe that we'll get some sort of idea on that with Saturday's show, Hard to Kill. I think, that main event, the result of the main event will probably tell a lot. Could you see an AEW star get involved? Someone else? Could you see others get involved? We talked about the reunion with the Bucks. Could they wind up being on this show? There's a lot of different possibilities and a lot of different directions I think you can go with this, and I don't think that they're far from done yet in terms of this whole partnership. And I know everyone has talked about, what else could they do in terms of the crossover potential with AEW. Could it involve New Japan? Could there be some possibilities there in terms of all the different things they could do? So it's going to be fun. It's going to be fun to see what happens, but I think it is something that still maybe, initially I think there were lots of that talk about dream matches and all those things. Maybe I think just the slow build that they've done with all this, people aren't as excited just because, there hasn't been a ton that's happened. You haven't had all those different crossovers and all that, because right away, just wanted to think, oh man, we're going to get all these dream matches right off the bat. But like I said earlier, I think just the slow build, the way they've done it, that at least presents a lot of things they can still do in the future and not have to rush them. So we'll see. We'll see what the developments are on Hard to Kill on Saturday. But speaking of New Japan, New Japan has announced their New Beginning tour cards for the upcoming tour that they're going to have there, which will involve several different title matches, and they were the ones that we expected when we talked about it with Ian Hamilton breaking down the action from Wrestle Kingdom and New Year's Dash. They pretty much set up all the matches we thought we'd see. It's going to be the first one in terms of you'll have the normal Road to shows with lots of different tag matches and all of that. Those will get started on January the 17th, so that'll get started at Korakuen Hall with the main event there, and that one will be Bushi and Hiromu Takahashi taking on Master Wato and Sho. And then from there, you'll have the Road to cards leading up to the January 30th, which is going to be the New Beginning in Nagoya. That show will be headlined by Shingo Takagi defending his never open weight title against Hiroshi Tanahashi. The semi-main event in that one is going to be Will Ospreay going one-on-one with Satoshi Kojima. Hiroshi Tenzan is going to make his return. We talked about him doing the stretcher job at New Year's Dash. He's going to get his big one-on-one match against Great-O-Khan in that to try to get his revenge on what happened to him at New Year's Dash. And then, the two big shows after that going to take place February 10th and February 11th. On those, the February 10th show, you're going to have the Guerrillas of Destiny defending the IWGP Tag Team Championships against Taichi and Zack Sabre Jr., Dangerous Tekkers. And for the IWGP Junior Heavyweight Championship, Hiromu Takahashi will defend the title against Sho on the February 11th. That is the big match of the tour, as it will be Kota Ibushi defending the IWGP Heavyweight Championship and Intercontinental Championship against Sonata, which is what they set up after Night 2 of Wrestle Kingdom. So really no surprises. I think we knew, given how they built things in terms of the potential pairings and all the different things they could do. Those are the ones that you pretty much knew you were going to get. Elsewhere, in terms of the non-title matches, as we said, Okan versus Tenzan, that one makes sense given what happened at New Year's Dash. You've also got Bushi versus Master Wato. That was set up in the last Angle promo there at New Year's Dash. That match is going to take place, the singles match, on February 10th. And they're also pairing off some of the others you can sort of see. It seems like, Okada and Evil are going to be paired off. They're in a lot of these tag team matches together, and that's something else that certainly is going to play a role here moving forward for them. It's also another thing worth noting is that, as expected, they're going to be moving up the start times on some of these shows just because of the state of emergency that's been declared there in Japan and really, in Tokyo and elsewhere, the surrounding areas. So they moved up the start time to a bit earlier to try to get people, I guess, home for that 8 p.m. It's not a hard curfew, but the government has pretty much urged citizens to refrain from going out after 8, for anything that is considered non-essential. So they're moving up the start time on some of those shows. I don't think it's on every one of them. You can find over at 411mania.com. I'm going to put the link to this in the show notes for all the different stories we've talked about. You'll be able to find that here in the show notes of the episodes. If you want to read, get more information on some of the things discussed here on this particular podcast, you can find the links to all those in the show notes, but you can find that there with a full list of times for all of these, but a lot of these shows going to be moved up for the start times there. Another thing on New Japan, before we wrap up with them, is that the New Japan Cup 2021 edition is going to take place in March. Last year they had to move it to June because of the pandemic, but now they did announce on Wednesday that the New Japan Cup is going to return in March. The action kicks off March the 5th at Corkin Hall and will climax on March the 20th and the 21st with the finals. So that's another, adds another bit of intrigue in terms of what's next as the Super J-Cast, the popular New Japan podcast, noted on their Twitter. It put up a graphic of the poster, and it is worth noting on the poster that Jay White is on there. What does that mean? Does it mean anything? I guess we don't really know, but Jay White's future has been a big discussion point in terms of, is he staying, is this a work, or could he actually be leaving New Japan, going to WWE? There's been lots of rumors, lots of speculation. You've seen reports saying that it's basically 50-50. Who knows? So I don't know. It's something. Can you read into these posters? When was this poster made? I think those are the questions we always ask in terms of these scenarios. But that at least offers more interest, I think, for people seeing this and going, okay, what's next for Jay White? Because after that promo he cut, which already is probably going to wind up being one of the best promos of the year for anyone in wrestling, even though it's very early in January, it's going to be a really hard one for a lot of people to top. But he did such a good job sort of selling the unknowns with his future that I think it's left a lot up in the air. And so people are saying, okay, well, is this the point where Jay White maybe comes back, wins the New Japan Cup, and then that sort of continues that story arc for him in terms of him finally getting his revenge, his road to redemption? Is this, the babyface Jay White in the future? Who knows? But there's certainly lots of interest, I think, surrounding this New Japan Cup and Jay White, of course. Some of the other potential winners in it, I think if you look at it, we see what they're doing with Will Ospreay and this Empire group, knowing that Ospreay, he's in a featured role on the New Beginning tour, getting that singles match against Kojima, but compared to some of the others, I think this is pretty much about the Empire trying to rebuild the Empire after losing all those matches at Wrestle Kingdom, like we talked about with Ian Hamilton. So could you see Will Ospreay in a spot to win this thing? I think absolutely. Could it be, some of the other obvious contenders in terms of Okada? Maybe Shingo is in there, Tanahashi. Maybe it's time for another potential, spot for him to kind of elevate him back up. Could Evil win it a couple years in a row here? I don't know, but I think there's lots of possibilities. And really, I think it's just sort of the state of things in Japan is going to play a role, in some of this in terms of maybe what it looks like with fans here in the near future with these New Beginning cards. Do they end up having to make adjustments? They already have the early start times. What things are going to look like, in March, we don't really know, but it's clear, at least they have the flexibility in terms of they've decided they're gonna do this, starting March 5th in the New Japan Cup. So they kind of have an outline of where they're going here, and maybe that's better than they had a year ago in terms of all the different things that were up in the air and not really knowing what they were going to be able to do maybe around that time last year. So we'll see, but that is kind of what's going on right now in New Japan. But there are some quick thoughts on what's going on in the world of wrestling right now as it pertains to some of the biggest companies in the professional wrestling, and we'll have certainly more thoughts here coming up on the 411 on Wrestling podcast. As I mentioned, if you want to check out more information on everything we talked about in today's episode of the podcast, I've got some links for you in the show notes from the stories we have on 411 Mania talking about some of these big news stories and some of the upcoming cards and everything going on with some of these promotions. So you can check all that out in the show notes, and of course continue to visit 411mania.com for lots of coverage of everything you need in pro wrestling. And as I continue to say, we'll have the link to the GoFundMe for Larry Zonka's family in the show notes. Continue to share and contribute if you can. Coming up on Friday's edition of the Retro Review, which we've started here to do every Friday. We're doing a Retro Review podcast here on the 411 on Wrestling podcast. And this Friday, we're going to talk about the 2001 Royal Rumble. Last week was Steve Cook. We talked about the 1992 Royal Rumble with Ric Flair's big shining moment there and Bobby the Brain Heenan's masterful commentary. This week, 9 years later, we talk about the 2001 Royal Rumble with Dissecting Dynamite host Andy Perez, who we've had on the podcast here a lot. We are going to discuss all the happenings from that period in 2001. Lots of big matches on that Royal Rumble card. You had Triple H versus Kurt Angle for the WWF title. The Royal Rumble match, which featured a lot of talent. An undercard, which you had Chris Jericho taking on Chris Benoit in a ladder match for the Intercontinental title. The Dudley Boys versus Edge and Christian. Chyna versus Ivory for the women's title. Lots of good stuff on that 2001 Royal Rumble card, and we're going to talk all about it with Andy Perez this Friday. So you can check that out, and be sure to go back and listen to some of these retro reviews we've done over the past several weeks. These are fun to do. They just add a little bit, retro type of feel to the podcast. So not only we talk about some of the stuff going on currently in the world of wrestling, also talk about some of the stuff from the past. So you guys seem to be enjoying that, so thanks as always. So we appreciate the feedback, and we'll have more of those coming up here on the podcast. So subscribe. Any podcast app you use, search for 411 on Wrestling, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, you name it. You can find us there. And thanks as always for listening to this episode of the podcast. Stay safe, and we'll talk to you next time here on the 411 on Wrestling podcast.